This is Branko Malic of Kali Tribune. In this podcast, we'll talk about the subject of so-called illusory problems in philosophy, or one could reformulate what is considered to be non-problems, but for some reason or the other sways the mind of some people, especially people who get to become famous in academic world and then in media and so on. Now, this notion of illusory problem, Scheinproblem in German, is something that took a radically different meaning in a different epochs of history. And what I'll be talking about here is the meaning that is given to this in the 20th century, especially in the domain of what is quite dubiously called analytic philosophy, or even British analytic philosophy, or Anglo-Saxon analytic philosophy, as if no other philosophy is analytic, and as if this philosophy is Anglo-Saxon product, which is not. In this context, Scheinproblem or illusory problem of philosophy is something that comes about because of the misuse of language that is common to human beings and to people. That is to say, people like Wittgenstein, whom I will take provisorily as somebody who gives the best, the apt exposition of this standpoint. They saw, people like Wittgenstein saw language as naturally inclined to drop head-on into the illusions, putting forward the questions that cannot be answered because the questions themselves are meaningless, are formulated on wrong, that is to say, unreal assumptions. This standpoint is, in my opinion, older than Wittgenstein. It is originated by Immanuel Kant's transcendental or critical philosophy. And mind you, if you click on the tag transcendentals underneath this podcast, you'll see few podcasts on Kali Tribune where I talk strictly about transcendentals, the term that originates in Middle Ages, and I treat it as the Middle Ages theologians and philosophers, or both in the same person, treated it, and is a standpoint I'm prone to accept myself. Now, Immanuel Kant had an insight into into state of mind of his academic contemporaries, that he judged to be wrong, that is to say that they indulge themselves in illusory problems, to wit that they think that the very fact that they can talk about being, immortal soul, God, the first cause of universe, or infinity or finity of universe, and so on, that is to say, to put forward metaphysical propositions, that this was wrong, that this was illusory knowledge, because it had no grounds in reality. For Kant, the reality, that the thing that gives knowledge reality, is what he calls conditions of possible experience. That is to say, he's not empirist. He doesn't say that experience gives the true content to some proposition that is intended to be scientific, but the fact that it conforms to the conditions of every possible experience. These conditions he calls transcendental, in the sense that make cognition possible, that make knowledge and things and the world about we have knowledge possible. And those conditions are free time, space, and categories of reason, whereby categories of reason are what was in times before Kant considered to be the most simple expressions of things in this world, of talking things, not really maybe talking about them, but saying them. If we take Aristotle's or Porphyrius or medieval standpoint in treatment of categories, well, Kant considered categories to be pure forms of reason, and 12 in number, and some of them, for instance, one very, very important was cause and effect. Causality was for Kant a category that everything that is, we have to understand in terms of sufficient reason. That is to say that everything is caused. Now, the reason being not because everything actually is caused, as some Christian saint would say, and theologian. That is to say, saint is the theologian who actually lives what he thinks. Well, we could put it like that. In Kant, the reason why we cannot understand the world out of the causal categories is because our experience is conditioned by cause and effect. And experience being conditioned means being unified for Kant. Cause and effect is the condition for unity of experience, or to be more precise, to unity of Einbildungskraft. Pure reine Einbildungskraft, that means the pure imagination, because for Kant there is this, one calls it mysterious power of human reason, which gives birth to these categories that reason then uses. Well, this is the place where experience, sensual experience, and what Kant would call outer world, and our own cognition, our own mind meet. So it so happens that it gives birth to these categories, that it gives them some kind of matter and reality. And we perceive categorical conditions as real. So we perceive that cause and effect are real, that you cannot think acausally, as some would say that you can after Kant. Well, the very thing, this is not false, of course. What is, I would say, false, that is to say, what is the moment where you see that Kant is on this trajectory of modernity, losing the touch with tradition and traditional metaphysics, although let us not pass judgments on him too quickly, because it is very questionable, was he in the position to think differently even, is that he says that what gives us the reason to be, what demonstrates to us, what explicates to us the necessity of causality, is the need of our own reason, of our own mind. The mind and reason are not the same thing in Kant, but they are subsumed under each other, like babushkas, these Russian dolls. So that's sometimes people make this mistake of conflating reason and mind. In Kant, it's not the same thing. Mind is where or intellect is where, Vernunft is where the problems start for Kant. So it is needed because for Kant the world is the unity of phenomena. Unity of phenomena means that world does not exist without subject perceiving it exists. Simple as that. On the other side of this, on the other side of the phenomena is a thing in itself. That is to say, the things as they are without being conditioned by subjective forms of experience, conditions, transcendental conditions of every possible experience. So we can know only the things that can be experienced. They don't have to be experienced, but they must be under these conditions. For instance, we have sciences that are, in Kant's view, not based on experience, as for instance Euclidean geometry, but are nevertheless give valid scientific statements, and what he calls so-called synthetic judgments or synthetic inferences a priori. Synthetic inference a priori is the inference we make without recurse to any given experience. That's a priori part, so it's pure from experience. Reine Urteil, the pure judgment or the pure inference. And synthetic means that nevertheless this inference gives us some new knowledge. So, to take an example, two straights moving in parallel will never meet. Now, nobody ever saw a straight that is infinite, because no one is infinite and no one can follow it to its end, but can infer that they will never meet. And for Kant, this is one of the demonstrative proofs that space is subjective form of Anschauung. English word will be intuition, best translation. That is to say, the space is a pure intuition. It is not a real, it is not a quality or quantifier or real of reality of real things, of things in themselves, but is a subjective condition under which phenomena are quote unquote given to us. Same applies to time. So Kant believed that statements like, for instance, when you say the world has, the being is the ultimate reality, are meaningless. They are not logically false, but they can give us no new experience, and they can relate to no possible experience. And this brought him into a situation that the only thing we have to deal with is the things that in some way are formed by us. Nevertheless, he was reasonable enough to preserve the fact that there are things that are not conditioned by consciousness, by subject, by us, we could say. For instance, he calls it transcendental perception. That's a kind of pure I, pure subjectivity that is in the background of all consciousness. And those things in themselves, in fact, sometimes people say that he means God, angels, and so on and so forth. Problem is, and this is why I'm doing this podcast, is that by following this line of argument, you come to realize that those things in themselves are things we deal about with in everyday life, including us, and that this kind of philosophy, in Kant's age, still respectable. Kant was still a great philosopher, is in fact making the world unreal and making intellect illogical. And this is very peculiar thing. Namely, in traditional metaphysics, let's call it metaphysics, but there are other forms of traditional knowing. This is completely absurd. Nobody thought about putting questions in this way, because how can world be product of conditions that are brought about by subjectivity. The very split between subject and object is not at work, and I use very often and purposefully use Thomas Aquinas to demonstrate this, because there is a prejudice against scholastics in general, and him in particular. He was not that popular with other scholastics, that this is something that stems from scholasticism. I think that in fact very opposite is true. Because while reading those authors, and you can see this for instance in Aristotle very much, very pronouncedly, you see that this subject-object discrepancy does not exist for them. So they don't think about I and the outside world. This is absurd for them. For Kant, this is not only not absurd, this is the fundament of philosophy. And Kant's strength is in the fact that he uses these traditional notions, but gives them different content and yields different results. So, we'll hang on to this statement. Being is not a real predicate, says Kant. This means that being is a word that is empty concept, that has no correspondence to anything real. And the reason why he thinks this is not because he just states there, I cannot demonstrate, cannot put my finger and say this is being in general. But he takes an assumption and believes that he demonstrates this assumption that intellect, which is the higher power, which is different, let's say, power than reason, takes the notions of reason, the categories, and empties them from the conditions of experience, sensual conditions, from content. So it removes time, space, and other restrictions. So being is considered to be at the same time, for instance, existent in the sense of cause. For instance, world has a cause at its origin. It has to have first cause, and no chain of causes and effects can go infinitely. And then he takes other statement: the world has no first cause in time, and the chain of causes and effects indeed moves into infinity. And what he does, he calls this antinomies of the pure reason, cosmological antinomies of pure intellect, reine Vernunft, antinomie. And he gives proofs for both statements and proves them both to be true. And for him, this is tautology. That means the inference that is always true, and that is true when it contradicts in its contradiction. And this means that it is not merely false, but meaningless. There is no knowledge in it. Now, just briefly, I will touch on this briefly because Kant deserves more, but I'll just say being is the necessity of thinking, at least thinking, because every thinking is thinking of being. What Kant says here is that he's in fact trying to avoid this fact and try to prove that the assumption that being is not condition of all thinking, that not all thinking is of being, is equally demonstrable. It is not equally demonstrable. But the problem is that Kant's notion of reality, of what is real, is restricted at materially conditioned sense experience. He is not a materialist, mind you, and he doesn't consider that matter is everything. He doesn't even take this into consideration to go on this assumption, but nevertheless, he's thinking in the terms of material and mechanical causality, very much mechanical, because his philosophy, scientific metaphysics, for Kant would be possible only in the form of Newtonian physics, because Newtonian physics was one of the inspirations for Kant. Excuse me. This is assumption under which indeed being has no reality. But if you go and hit the tag being, you'll see a few articles and podcasts about this where I talk about this notion. This is one of the medieval transcendentals. This is very important. This is the main subject of philosophy, one might say, of metaphysics. Is something quite different. And now people like Wittgenstein in 20th century moved further than Kant. But they did it in the sense that not continuing this line of thought, because they are very ahistorical thinkers. Wittgenstein himself was famous for not reading history of philosophy, ignoring a lot of it, because as he said, if I would read Hegel, I would go mad. But he had no problems of criticizing Hegel, nevertheless. Wittgenstein was a kind of man that completely disregarded this notion that you have to in some way honor the tradition from which you stem. He was completely and quite innocently, childishly just ignoring it, and some of his strengths lay in this because it is very authentic. He was no holds barred philosopher. He went all the way and went, of course, the wrong way. But let us give him some credit, at least. Where was I? Yeah. He took it, he and the whole group of philosophers that were his contemporaries, older and some younger contemporaries, put this in Kantian, in my opinion, really Kantian way of looking at things in the language. So they formulated things in the sense that not only our mind is having an illusions and inventing unreal problems as unreal subjects, as being, God, beautiful, true, and so on and so forth, but that this is something that is done by language. Assumption is that mind, as a special self-subsisting power or hypostasis, does not exist. And this is something that Kant, to his credit, considered existent. So Kant never thought that mind or reason are functions of brain or nervous system. That was never on his mind. They were not bodily powers. They had bodily operations maybe, but in essence they were immaterial. And this is the hidden assumption in this so-called linguistic turn in philosophy, where philosophy went into language for a disastrous result, for in fact suicide of philosophy, or if we prefer, as I do, not considering people like Wittgenstein and other philosophers at all, it is more like attempted murder of philosophy, not very successful in essence. And Wittgenstein, I'm picking him up because he's maybe the most radical of all of them. He put forward that those questions, what he calls problems, illusions of language that have to be cured, that the only thing that philosophy can do is to prove itself meaningless, that every question that is put forward by philosophy is in fact meaningless, the only real questions being questions of natural sciences and that philosophy has to be cast aside, and what we have instead it is some kind of mysticism. People sometimes cut him some slack because he was he was Catholic, he was converted, Jewish convert to Catholicism, I think, whole his life. And he read Kierkegaard. For some reason, people, when you read Kierkegaard, people by default consider you religious. I have no idea why. Anyway, he posited that the relation between language and things, this form of sentence, what we call from the Satz, is something that is mystical, that is literary, something that shows itself in language, but cannot be talked about, because everything you say about it is either tautology or contradiction, and so on and so forth. So you cannot assume that any kind of sentence you make on these metaphysical things has has relation to any kind of reality. But for some wondrous reason, any assumption you make, correct assumption in natural sciences, has this. Of course, Wittgenstein's assumption is that natural sciences, as they were in his time, are the perfect mode of language, and that their subjects are the only subjects that can be spoken of in meaningful way. This is far from true, of course, and this yielded this development in philosophy that was in continuity with works of George Boole, Gottlieb Frege, mathematicians who tried to found logic on mathematics, or that is to say, on mathematical axiomatic, and by logic they thought every form of human thinking, yielded, among other things, computer languages in their primitive form, and completely emptied traditional logic of all content, because they put forward the idea that the thing that makes logic true, in inverted commas, is the procedure, whereas the meaning, that is to say, what scholastics call suppositio, the nature that is expressed or reflected in the concepts that you talk about when making inferences, has no relevance. So you have purely formal logic, formal procedural logical calculus, mathematization of thinking, and this means quantifying of thinking. Now, this is too broad a subject for me to get into at this one take. You will find in the show notes excellent article of Daniel G. Castellano, American author, about this subject, which I warmly recommend reading. It's a series of articles that is unfortunately still unfinished, but the part that is completed is a very long read, but very rewarding. So I will invoke help of this fine author, so I don't have to go speaking for 2 hours without notes. And when you speak about these things without notes, someone will be pedantic enough to poke holes into your quotations of philosophers like Wittgenstein and such, and there is no reason to go that way. Now, why this happens? What is it that happened? Well, the thing that happened is that Wittgenstein can tell you that there is no, for instance, statement about beautiful. There are. This is something that he, in his Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, this famous book of his, says that aesthetic judgments are meaningless. So you cannot talk about beautiful, you cannot talk about truth, save in the way of how close it approximates the judgments of physicists and so on, and such things. In a word, it ends up in the absurdity, and truth be told, Wittgenstein himself said of his last propositions of his Tractatus is that that Tractatus itself should be thrown aside once it is comprehended. It was, of course, it is my opinion, always was my opinion, that Wittgenstein's approach to philosophy was kind of therapy, and rather an successful therapy of his own psychological maladies, of his own problems, intellectual and psychological problems that he projected onto the whole body of thought. Because note what happens here, the whole history is rendered meaningless. That is to say, history of ideas. Everything for Aristotle, Plato, theologians, pagan and Christian, Muslim if you like, nobody among them save some sophists, for instance, or nominalists, like William of Ockham, in Orthodoxy, Varlam, and such people. They were the only ones that at least glimpsed that there is a problem here. So only we in the beginning of 20th century came to realize that this word being is nothing but taking the Greek verb eimi and its various forms to refer to real thing. Well, I find this from common sense standpoint, even before we go into deeper arguments about it, a very dubious assumption. And indeed it is far more than dubious, it is completely wrong. Now, being as a transcendental, for instance, if we talk about it in the form of transcendental, means a lot of things, each of them quite real. Because being as a transcendental is also a name of God, as the good is also the name of God. That is to say, the things that can, what is called cataphatically, affirmatively can be said of God without not expressing his essence, which is impossible, but neither completely missing it, but telling you something of him, not him. Now, when people say that being is too, how would we put it, is a kind of hypostasization of the word, that Greeks for some reasons took the word estin, for instance, which means is, in the sentence, and made it into a thing. Well, first of all, in ancient Greek, whoever had any knowledge of ancient Greek will remember that in ancient Greek, this auxiliary verb is rarely used. In ancient Greek, you didn't use auxiliary verbs that often, but they are guessed from context. For instance, you have in Heraclitus, famous gnome, riddle of Heraclitus, so to speak, one of his sayings, ethos anthropos daimon, which means, roughly translated, the man's character is his destiny. Well, daimonos is a demon, but in Greek, daimonos is closer to be understood as some kind of guardian angel or a a being that drives you to do something. You will notice ethos, which means character in this context, anthropos, which means man, daimon, which means daemon, or destiny, or the way through life, or something like that, of providence even. You will not notice the verb to be. So this is just a form of this language. So it's highly dubious that they, from the overuse of the verb to be in an abstract sense, that they came to this idea. This is in itself rather dubious. But the thing is that being is the expression that transcends everything we can conceive in genera, in terms of genera and species. Being is not a genera. Being is not matter of something in the sense that everything that is some species of being. This is not the thing. The being transcends this. And by virtue of this, it transcends, first of all, matter, because it, in the broadest sense of the term, it transcends contraction. It is not contracted. It is absolutely infinite, uncontracted reality. Now, when you talk about uncontracted reality, different laws apply, I believe. Different rules apply than the rules that Kant would call conditions of pure experience, because experience in itself is by definition contracted. And in the Kant's example, you have the pure contraction. You have the contraction or limitedness put forward as an absolute principle. And then you have a world which is kind of like aquarium of phenomena that is surrounded by the things in themselves about which we can know nothing. On the other hand, in traditional metaphysics, it's rather simple. Being is a necessity of thought, because thinking everything, thinking anything you thinking being, the first act of thinking is already thinking being. And for instance, Thomas Aquinas, who was notorious for this Aristotle interpretation, Aristotelian approach, and he was rather isolated in this. Even his teacher, Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, who was enthralled by Aristotle, was not Aristotelian. His ideas are more let's say, going into a direction that transcends the senses and so on and so forth. But Thomas Aquinas stubbornly insists on this holding to, among other things, this reality of senses. And then you have to ask yourself, he says, the being is the condition of being and knowing. Every truth you find, when you track it to its source, will resolve into being, and every intelligent realization you resolve to its beginning will resolve back into intellect. And intellect is intuition of this existence of being, of this pure act, pure energy of being. And then Thomas says, for instance, and this is strictly Christian thing, this is the peculiarity of Christianity, nevertheless, all knowledge for humans primarily comes to senses. And then when you think that how can he not see this, you realize that he's telling you, what he's telling you is that the original state of man is such that his body is sacrosanct. So there is this assumption of the fall. So we have this, let's say, flawed perception. But this doesn't mean that perception, the body itself, is flawed in itself, it is good in itself. And this is people who have these Platonic clinics, which is quite normal. especially if one loves metaphysics and so on, kind of have problems with this, and this is extremely irritating. Why he repeats that, and then you realize because he's not taking a man as a being that is split in kind of like two worlds, which was symptomatic for Kant's approach, for instance, because he was even talking about man as a being of two worlds, being of the world of necessity, that is to say, this mechanical causality of nature that includes our body, and the kingdom of purposes, or the kingdom of mind, that is to say, a moral kingdom of intellect that can and must work on moral imperatives. So you have this split. You have this split, of course, because he doesn't take into consideration the unity of being that is at work in a contractic sense in man. This is where being comes into play. Because being is the mean between more or less everything. But in this sense, body and soul, there is no real distinction between them in the sense that they are two, they are one, but really distinct, or distinctively real. These are the terms you can apply here. This is something that sounds like antinomy, and then you realize it's not antinomy. It is, in fact, what the reality is. So you have the instance where you have being, where you see this notion that Wittgenstein would call meaningless, not only wrong, but meaningless. He cannot understand why people ever used this fucking word. Excuse my language, but it's extremely irritating. He cannot realize this. And he cannot realize this because he don't see the obvious. To see these things, you don't have to be especially philosophically talented, because all people, most or at least vast majority of people, see this, but of course because they don't study it, they don't analyze it, they don't ponder for decades like some idiots, like yours truly, they don't have means to express this in words, maybe, or sometimes even they do. After a few beers, I saw it happen. So this is the reason. From the standpoint of somebody like Aquinas, but you can put a lot of different names that were very antagonistic, for instance, to him, but were nevertheless standing in the same understanding of reality. From their standpoint, these Kantian or Wittgensteinian notions would be completely absurd. Kant, they would take into consideration probably, but I think they would consider Wittgenstein to be lunatic of the kind of, for instance, Cratylus, that legendary disciple of Heraclitus, who believed that as Heraclitus said, you cannot step twice into the same river, and Cratylus believed you cannot step even once in it. He stopped talking because it was obvious that as everything is in flux, he cannot say anything meaningful. And this is, maybe this is a legend, because if he was a pupil of Heraclitus, I think he would be smarter. Heraclitus is very mysterious and very poignant philosopher, but this is in fact pathological state. This is not normal state. This is not state in which majority of people live. Although I do have there is this tendency, just to point this out also, in philosophy, in modernity, that philosopher has to have take your pick, schizophrenia, syphilis, psychosis, paranoia, whatever. You must be a bit crazy and genius and so on. Well, there is something corresponding to this in the Middle Ages and Antiquity. They call it black bile, melancholia. So that this gives you this disposition to pondering, to intellect, that it is tied with some kind of melancholic character. But it was not so pronounced, because when you see those people, the characters of great philosophers of antiquity and Middle Ages, they were very balanced persons. They were, and the way they approached philosophy was not from some kind of peak experiences and whatnot, and thinking on the heights, as Nietzsche would say, trying to catch an eagle from the heights of Sils Maria and such things. No. They were very mundane. They used very mundane examples. They were talking, as Plato, for instance, in quite in very stylish but conversational Greek language, in dialogue form. This is something very different. And to bring things to a close by resolving aporia, back to the beginning, we see that these notions, as I took an example of being, of traditional metaphysics, are necessities. How can you think, I ask you, the unity of body and soul without this? Without unity? Because for somebody like Wittgenstein, unity is also meaningless. You cannot talk about unity of body and soul, let alone Father and the Son in Jesus Christ, and God the Father. But then you cannot talk about your unity with your Father, because there is a bond of unity that is causal. There is a bond of likeness that transcends mere mechanical causality. And it is there. And there is this, as I often like to point out, this principle of effects reverting into causes. And this is what happens. That is something you can see in your lives, especially if you are male, in this likeness to your father. I already talked about this. This is one mundane example of something profound, but because everything mundane is profound to some extent, because being is everywhere, so everywhere it is profound. There is this necessity of likeness, of son recurring always back into his father's likeness, sometimes doing things the same way he did it, or doing them even unconsciously, trying to do them better, or the opposite way, and so on and so forth. This is the expression of unity. This is a contraction of being. You cannot talk about this the other way. You can talk about this in everyday speech, but if you want to have some understanding of the world, you will have to use words and notions that modern and postmodern philosophy considers meaningless, illusory. On the other hand, from this standpoint, and I do believe that this is a standpoint of reality, not merely for philosopher like me, let's say, but for manual worker, for public officials, for people of all walks of life, normal people, just people. This is the reality. And the problems that people like those modern philosophers pose are completely meaningless in turn. Their problems are meaningless because there are no problems. They cannot, they end up with making up problems like this in system theories, where they try to have the scientific theory of everything and system creating. And we have it in this global climate change thing, something I wrote about already and will write in the future about some documents of Kluber from where they lay down these epistemological principles of the disaster science, as I would call it, in the early 70s. Late 60s, early 70s, and then you see people who deny the existence, for instance, of the real problems, and in turn are devising science of creating unreal problems. It's a very interesting discrepancy. Anyway, this went on very long. Hope you found it interesting and informative. This was Branko Malic of Kali Tribune signing out.